Okay, so we've been covering Micah chapter 1 through 7 throughout the class. And here, as we get to the end, we're going to wrap up our thoughts. We're going to move through the final part of the text. And you know where we've been going. We've spent a lot of time condemning the people for their behavior. We've gotten glimpses of the hope, the salvation that God has to offer his people and the nation that he wants them to be a part of as we move through chapter 4 and into the farther parts. There's been specific condemnations for the leaders. And now, as we get here towards the end, we're looking at some thoughts that are, I think, coming from the prophet himself. The prophet in chapter 7 is going to react to some of these thoughts, and we'll see some of the final bits of the encouragement here at the end. Let's go ahead and read chapter 7, and I've asked Robbie to do that for us. We'll move through there, and then we'll break it down a little bit.
Woe is me, for I have become as when the summer fruit has been gathered, as when the grapes have been gleaned, there is no cluster to eat. No first ripe fig that my soul desires. The godly has perished from the earth, and there is no one upright among mankind. They all lie in wait for blood, and each hunts the order with a net. Their hands are on what is evil, to do it well. The prince and the judge ask for a bribe, and the great man utters the evil desire of his soul. Thus they weave it together. The best of them is like a briar, the most upright of them a thorn hedge. The day of your watchman, of your punishment has come. Now their confusion is at hand. Put no trust in a neighbor. Have no confidence in a friend. Guard the doors of your mouth, her who lies in your arms. For the son treats the father with contempt. The daughter rises up against her mother. The daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. A man's enemies are the men of his own house. For as for me, I will look to the Lord. I will wait for the God of my salvation. My God will hear me. Rejoice not over me, O my enemy. When I fall, I shall rise. When I sit in darkness, the Lord will be a light to me. I will bear the indignation of the Lord, because I have sinned against him until he pleads my cause and executes judgment for me. He will bring me out to the light. I shall look upon his vindication. Then my enemy will see, and shame will cover her who said to me, where is the Lord your God? My eyes will look upon her. Now she will be trampled down like the mire of the streets. A day for the building of your walls. In that day the boundary shall be far extended. In that day they will come to you from Assyria and the cities of Egypt, and from Egypt to the river, from sea to sea, from mountain to mountain. But the earth will be desolate because of its inhabitants, for the fruit of their deeds. Shepherd your people with your staff, the flock of your inheritance, who dwell alone in a forest, in the midst of a garden land. Let them graze in Bashan and Gilead, as in the days of old, as in the days when you came out of the land of Egypt. I will show them marvelous things. The nations shall see and be ashamed of all their might. They shall lay their hands on their mouths. Their ears shall be deaf. They shall lick the dust like a serpent, like the crawling things of the earth. They shall come trembling out of their strongholds. They shall turn in dread to the Lord our God, and they shall be in fear of you. Who is a God like you, pardoning iniquity and passing over transgression for the remnant of his inhabitants? He does not retain his anger forever, because he delights in steadfast love. He will again have compassion on us. He will tread our iniquities underfoot. You will cast all our sins into the depths of the sea. You will show faithfulness to Jacob and steadfast love to Abraham, as you have sworn to our fathers from the days of old.
Okay, thank you. I know that's a long reading. So, like I said, we're here at the end. We're here as the prophet is considering the message he's been given throughout the entirety of this book. And like I mentioned, I think there's some of his voice that comes into focus here at the beginning of this chapter. So the first portion, I've broken it down, verses 1 through 6, as sort of the beginning section. And we see that given the great nature of all the condemnation that's been coming upon Israel, the great accusations, the sins that have been levied against Israel, I think the prophet starts by lamenting the state of his nation. It's pretty common in the prophet's writings and some other biblical writings to see at which point certain individuals, usually prophets or other prominent Bible characters, will write and confess sin on behalf of the nation. Typically, when we see sin being confessed in the Bible, sometimes it's an individual confessing their own sin. You think of like David after his sin in 2 Samuel. Or in moments like this, where the prophet Micah confesses on behalf of the entire people. Some other moments where I think that happens, I think you can see that kind of in Ezra 9. He brings a confession before the Lord on behalf of Israel. I think Daniel 9, there's some elements there, and certainly in Nehemiah's prayer in chapter 1. My goal this morning isn't to talk about how that happens or what the virtue of that is, but I do want you to be aware that that's a thing that happens in the Bible quite frequently. We could have a greater discussion about how to do that appropriately or what use and what value there is in doing that. I think given what we've seen in this book, it feels appropriate. The prophet clearly has a vision of what has occurred in Israel. He's heard the accusations from God, and so I don't know that there's any hubris here in the mouth of the prophet. He's coming before God and confessing this sin on behalf of the people. And I want to reiterate that I've tried to not be shy about that in our class. I think that when I see some of these sins, I think I see America involved in some of these problems as well, and so I think this is a book that helps us. I think we can see the accusations and hopefully take them to heart just as well. We are to not think of ourselves as any better than the audience here. We ought to take the same message that Micah brings to his people. And in the face of such great devastation, in the face of great sin and judgment, what can the prophet do except mourn? Right? This is a thing that brings him great sorrow. I don't know about you, but I feel like I can relate to that pretty intimately. I see the sins in my nation. I see the sins that surround us in the world, and they bring me great sorrow. They make me very sad. The prophet mourns the current state of Israel here. I think evil should make us sorrowful. I think it should bring us to mourn. And I think we should long for the salvation and the judgment of the Lord, whatever that may look like. Because what we're going to find here later on in the chapter is that judgment is indeed righteous, and it's something that the prophet looks forward to. He begins to elaborate on what this sorrow is, what things bring him sorrow, and he notices a couple things in particular. He mentions that the land has been devastated here, reference to the fact that there's the grapes have been gleaned, there's no cluster to eat, no first ripe fig that my soul desires in verse 1. He's hungry because I think what he's trying to draw here is the conclusion that righteousness, just like comfort food, is missing from the land. It's gone. Instead of the fruit of righteousness, the people of Micah's day are doing very much what Amos says in chapter 6, verse 12. They're turning justice into poison, and the fruit of righteousness into wormwood. I think we need to see here that sin it's a consuming force. It's going to leave you impoverished. It's going to leave you starving. It's going to leave you penniless. You will be used up when you are living a life of sin, when you are living in a nation full of sin. These things will wear down on you. I know a number of years ago, there was a movie made by a gentleman named Darren Aronofsky, and he did a movie about the story of Noah. There was a lot of controversy around that film because it took some great liberties, but I think one of the things that the film did really, really well is it portrayed the world of the flood, which was a world we know was consumed by sin, as used up. I think that's something that stuck with me from that portrayal. And we see a little bit of that here in Israel as well. Sin has used up the land. It's used up the people. The people have been used up as well. The righteous are gone. Only predators remain here. It says that the godly have perished from the earth in verse 2. There's no one upright among mankind. They lie in wait for blood, and each hunts the other with a net. As for evil, both hands do it well in verse 3. And so, that's a pretty easy thing for us to understand. There's nobody good left. And maybe that's a little bit of hyperbole. We know that the Lord is going to preserve a remnant, but remember, I think we're talking in some hyperbolic language here, as the prophets are usually wont to do. The virtues of the leaders have been devastated as well. He says the leaders and the judges are corrupt. Once great men are now seeking debased pleasure on their own whims. I wrote down the word capricious there. I think maybe that might show up in some versions. The people are plotting together. The leaders are plotting together. We know that they were oppressing those who were underneath them. It says the best is like a thorn bush. No one is going to be able to come close to these individuals, these leaders, these judges, without having their own flesh torn to shreds. And these things should bring us sorrow, I think. The prophet also confesses that punishment for these evils is coming. And so he's affirming the message that God has given him throughout the entirety of the book. If you're in the circles that I'm in, you might have heard the phrase high trust society, low trust society. You might have heard those phrases thrown around recently. I think these are things that we can understand. This is becoming a more low trust society. He says setting a watchman won't do them any good. Having guardrails like they typically would isn't going to protect them from both the evil within and I think the judgment that's coming from without. And of course, in such a society, somebody can't trust their neighbors or their friends, and that's something that's going to be affecting them as well here. There's implications here. You're not going to be able to trust your lover with secrets in your own home. Children are going to betray their parents and their in-laws. Again, I think there's a lot of hyperbole that's being used here. But isn't it true that sometimes when evil begins to creep into your own home, that the closest to you are the ones that become your downfall in a wicked and distressed society. Hasn't that happened to some of us? Hasn't some of the closest people that we've been interacting with, the people that we know and love the most, those of our own household, have we not experienced some of that? I think we have in some cases. The difficulty with all this and recognizing this is not only is it good, it's true, it's righteous, and sometimes good and true news is not pleasant. I think the prophet understands that. There's a temptation here, though, as we look at this. I think the difficulty in recognizing all of this evil, whether it's in his day or whether it's in our day, is then to long for the times of old, simpler days when things were better. I think we need to be careful of that, because that can be kind of the lying voice of nostalgia that creeps in and affects the way we think. Maybe the days before were better, maybe they weren't. But I think what we can be guaranteed of is that there were days before that were better, and there were days before that were worse, and there were days before that were better, and days that were before that were worse. You see my meaning here? You catch what I'm trying to say? The difficulty is we need to avoid bathing in the sickly gold spring that is pining for the days of old, hoping they will be revived just to save us. That's not going to save Micah here. Just returning to the way it was isn't going to fix it. Instead, I think we're going to find throughout the rest of this chapter that there's another place he turns to for salvation. It's not nostalgia. It's not reform. It's something else in particular. Thoughts, comments, questions about the beginning of the chapter here? Any observations you want to make? Any things you would like to add? Rob.
It reminded me of Matthew 10, and Jesus said, "Think not that I come to send peace on the earth. I come not to send peace, but a sword. For I am come to set a man at variance against his father, the daughter against her mother, the daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. The man's foes shall be all in his own household." So Jesus used this exact reference over in Matthew to point out what was going to happen to Christians. You don't always have this great relationship in your own group. I've seen that in my life. I have seen that even in my own family, but in others, where just because you're a Christian doesn't infer that your relatives and your close are going to follow you in that path.
Good observation. I mean, these are the people of God, and so these are words being spoken about the people of God. When the judgment of the Lord comes, it's inevitably going to be a conflict-laden thing. It's going to divide people from one another, and I think that is going to be true today as much as it was probably true in those days. And so that some of that conflict was going to be physical, right? Foreign nations were going to come in and oppose them. Some of that conflict is going to be spiritual, and it's going to be clashing of ideas. Another comment, yes. One here and one here.
Yeah, it just strikes me that the Bible speaks of this. I mean, the Roman Empire lasted 300 years. The Syrian Empire lasted, 300, 500 years. All of them about 300 years, all the great empires. And Solomon summed it up. He said, there's nothing new under the sun.
Yep, there's nothing new here, I think, either. Sin is condemned.
Yeah, to follow on Rob's comment, it's interesting that, of course, Jesus came back and we read about what he said in Matthew, some fairly short period of time after the intertestamental period of 400 years. So it's interesting to me that the last scripture that we see in our Bibles deals with this quote at the end of Malachi, chapter 7. And then in the gospel, in Matthew, we see the exact same thing. So in other words, that 400 years of silence, where I'm sure many thought he was gone. He was dead, he was gone. Nothing's changed. Jesus picks right up where Malachi left off. And I find that interesting. And I'm saying that without having researched the chronology too well, so maybe I'm off a little bit there. But at least in the order of our Bible, I find that very interesting. Yeah.
Makes sense why the elders have picked Malachi for the next thing we're going to study here. So we're going to move right into that, see some of those same themes pick up. Good. Is there one over here?
You know, I'm going to show my age here, but there used to be this song, I never promised you a rose garden. Some people probably can relate to that, but you know, I often think about why are books in the Bible like this in here? And it always goes back to me that God gives us the chance to see how without him, how bad things can be. And yet in verse 7, that's kind of like our focus. I know you haven't got there yet, so I don't want to steal any of your thunder, but it's odd to me how if we turn in and we look at ourselves and look at each other, what the outcome is going to be. And yet we see this pattern over and over and over again in books of the Bible. And yet there's always this, like you said, a remnant or this spark or this verse that kind of turns us back to where our focus should be.
Yep, that's going to be an excellent segue. You're right on the money. You know where I'm going next. Any other thoughts, comments, questions? Okay, let's move on to verse 7. So verses 7 through 13 is the next section that I have written out. So like I mentioned, I don't know that looking necessarily to days of old is going to be the solution here. Maybe it's not wrong to want reform. It's not wrong to want the old days to come back in terms of returning to serving the Lord, maybe in ways that they did. But what I'm saying here is that he looks to a different place for salvation, and we find that in verse 7. But as for me, I will look to the Lord. I will wait for the God of my salvation. My God will hear me. The contrast here, he's waiting for the justice of the Lord in the face of coming destruction. And the prophet begins to extol and hold up God as a God of salvation. We'll wait for the God of my salvation. In many ways, I think this is language that is common to the prophets. This is something that the first image that comes to mind is in Habakkuk chapter 3, which Rodney doesn't know this, but Habakkuk is actually my favorite minor prophet. Micah is only number 2. So you got me for this one, but Habakkuk is the one I really, really love. Habakkuk 3, verses 16 through 19, Habakkuk's so deeply moved by the sins of his people, he also does some of this lamenting. He cries out on behalf of the people. Both the prophets passionately agree here that they regret the fact that there are too few righteous people to be found in the land, but in the same way, both of these prophets, they declare that despite coming tragedy, they're going to rejoice in the salvation of the Lord. So you'll find that same language at the end of Habakkuk's prophecy. In verse 8, he says, "Do not rejoice over me, enemy of mine. Though I fall, I will rise. I will live in darkness. The Lord is a light for me." That is the most triumphant thing that I can think of for him to say here in this moment. He's looking in the face of his enemies. He's defying them. He's telling them not to get excited about the fact that he's going to be judged and punished by God, because just as quickly as God is going to judge these people, we've seen he's going to pick them back up. Right? We've talked about that throughout the entirety of this book. There's going to be a judgment, but after that judgment passes, he's going to bring the people back up. He's going to give them a place of prominence again. And I think, we get to see a solution. We get to see an image of what that looks like in chapter 4, that mountain where all the people of the nations come to be at the foot of the mountain and listen to God. God is going to be their salvation as much as he's going to be their judgment. And the prophet, he holds these things in tension. If you're like me, that's kind of hard to do. It's hard to think about the justice of the Lord and the mercy and the power of the Lord being handed to you in equal measure. Because like we've said in the past, we can only see about this far into the future. And we can't really see the way God deals with things, which is why it's so good that the prophet tells us, that God tells us the way he deals with people. In verse 9, the prophet admits that the rage of God is righteous. He says in verse 9, "I will bear the indignation of the Lord because I have sinned against him until he pleads my cause and executes judgment for me." Micah honorably, he takes responsibility for the sin of the people. This always comes to mind whenever I see someone in the Bible doing this. There's a story told by, it's kind of myth at this point, so I don't know if it's true or not, but the Times of London once in the early 1900s posed this question to several prominent authors: what is wrong with the world today? And the famous answer that came back is from G.K. Chesterton. He said it's most likely to have said, he responded with a 3-word essay. He said, "Dear sir, I am." And that's, I think, what the prophet is saying here as well. I have sinned, we have sinned, and the righteousness of God in his judgment is going to come upon us. I know I've sinned, therefore I will accept my correction. But on top of that acknowledgement, he also says that God is an advocate and a judge. He pleads my case and executes justice for me. This falls into line with everything we know about Jesus from the New Testament. There's portraits of him as a judge, as a mediator, and as a justifier throughout the entirety of the New Testament. Just a short collection of some of these references. 1 Timothy 2, verse 5 references Jesus as a mediator. In Hebrews 9:15, his mediation, because I can speak well. His mediation is evidence of the new covenant. In John chapter 14, verse 6, Christ is the way to God, right? The pathway there. In Romans chapter 8, verses 26 and 27, the Spirit intercedes for us with groanings too deep to be uttered. In Galatians 3, verses 19 and 20, there's some description there. A mediator implies more than one party, but God is one, right? That's something Paul writes. In Hebrews chapter 8, verse 6, Christ is a mediator, and he is superior to the old law. So you'll find these references throughout the entirety of the New Testament, that God is both the judge and the one who executes justice. So he has both of these scales in his hand. And I think this all kind of culminates in when the text says, he will bring us out into the light. Don't you want that? I want that. I want to be brought out into the light by the Lord. That's very much like, Plato's cave, right? If you know about that allegory, you live your whole life seeing shadows, and then finally you're brought into the real world. You see the light at the end of the tunnel, and you can finally see what has been hidden from you for however long you've been in that place. I want to be brought out into the light by the Lord. There's going to be harshness that comes with that. You're going to have to acknowledge your sin, but I think there's something greater waiting on the other side. He will bring us out into the light. What a beautiful thought. Of course, at the end of this section here, the enemies of Israel are going to see her destruction. They're going to mock God as a result of Israel's destruction. But this mocking, this attitude is going to be what is destruction to those people as well. The people who doubt and mock God's power are not going to be rewarded for it. The deliverance of God's people is going to be the confusion of her enemies, I think, here at the end of this passage. It's going to be their shame. It's going to be doubled up, especially when they've been the ones who've been trampling on God's people this entire time. They themselves will be trampled upon as well. And in verses 12 and 13, you see that this desolation is going to be complete. The destruction of the wicked here is then what God ends up using as a foundation to build upon for the rest of this passage. Even though Jerusalem's walls might be in ruin, there's going to be a day when they're going to be repaired. Israel shall come from all of the remote parts, not turning back as a result of their opposition, which they've been facing up to this point. And we see that happen physically, right? There is a time of returning after opposition. But I think it means something as well in a greater sense. There's a greater return that's being described here as well. I don't think it's going to be military conquest for Israel. This is something we talked about in chapter 5. This is something more spiritual, and I think that this helps us to understand what that is going to look like. Instead, there's going to be a building of a spiritual home. Remember all those nations streaming into the mountain in chapter 4? Even though God's enemies might seem to prevail against us, they might rejoice. You might notice that. I don't think we should despair. This is the promise that God gives us. Nothing's going to be able to block the favors that God intends for his people. He's going to accomplish that end, regardless of what opposition on earth he might face. And the coolest thing about all this is I think we get to be a part of this. This process that God deals with his people, striving with his people, rewarding them, protecting them from danger, we get to witness some of that as well. And I'm sure if I talk to you individually, you'd have moments in your lives where you can recognize some of this. I think we can recognize moments in our nation's history where things get protected by God. I think I don't want to plant my flag necessarily and say God did this or God did that. I want to be careful about that. But I do want to say that I think God cares for his people, and there's a lot of God's people in America, and I think we can be excited about that. Thoughts, comments, questions about sections 7 through 13? I have one more section here, but go ahead, Chandler.
One of the things that I was thinking of in the first 6 verses was how, like we've said it before, the people who you should be able to depend upon, the leaders, the people guiding you, you can't depend on them. They're accepting bribes. You can't rely on the judges. And then to go into your neighbors, you should be able to at least trust your neighbor. If you can't trust a stranger, you can't even trust your neighbor. And then you should at least be able to trust the people in your own house. You can't even trust them. So to me, it's like this desperation of like, I have nowhere to turn to. I'm completely depleted from all of my options. And then verse 7, I will wait for the God of my salvation. My God will hear me. Like the confidence in my God will hear me, how we can depend on God in those times. I think that is something where maybe we, not day to day, we're not experiencing these things where we, can't depend on anyone in our house or in our neighborhood or in our leadership, but people still fail us. And I think oftentimes in those moments, even if it doesn't look exactly like this, even though sometimes it does feel just like this, I just think that juxtaposition where people will fail us and we can't depend on people to act like God. And that can really mess us up in our minds if we're not then turning to verse 7 and that confidence in my God will hear me. The Lord will be a light to me. He will bring me out to the light. All of those phrases has so much complete dependence on God of like, if this doesn't work for me, then I truly have nothing. And I think being in that place is such a valuable lesson for us when we learn we really can only depend on God, and that's such a blessing.
Yeah, this is emblematic of God's character, right? This is what he tells Paul: in your weakness, I am made strong. In their desperation, God is the one who saves them. And I think part of the problem here is that we get trapped in our own heads and we scramble, right? In desperation, we scramble for salvation. We look everywhere we can, other people, our money, our own intellect, like we pick everything but God first. And it's not until all of that stuff's devastated that we can kind of get out of our own way and realize that God is the one that brings us out of this trouble. He brings us into the light. They've been devastated, right? That they've lost faith in everything, their leaders, their families. It's a good observation. Is there another comment, another question? One up here. Right here, right here. Sorry.
Just the whole big picture of how a society disintegrates when they're not following after God's ways. And, coming into the light, what you talked about, G.K. Chesterton, I love that passage. When we recognize we are the problem, and I love some of the prayers in the Bible, like from Nehemiah, where Nehemiah is broken over and mourning over the state of the wall in Israel, or Jerusalem, and he says, "Forgive me and my father. We have sinned greatly." In other words, we can't just look to the people out there, the people that don't know God. It is we who have sinned, and we, even though there's a remnant, we have to recognize our part in it. And I think when a society disintegrates, the verses 5-7 were very real to me, as I have heard so many stories. My sister, my father, mainly my sister lived the longest under communism, and God is taken out of society under communism, and there was a distrust for everyone. You were fearful. You couldn't trust your neighbor. Your neighbor was your enemy, people in your household. So just the disintegration of things when God is taken out of the picture, and to recognize that we all as God's people have a part. When God says, when my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray.
Yeah, when I look at the things that affect us, when I look at the way sin affects our world, our society, like it is a stark contrast with the image in chapter 4, right? This place where no one's afraid, no one wants for anything, and they're all gathered to hear what God has to say. Man, do I want that. Man, do I want that, because this stuff happens. Because we see elements of this in our world. And I want the other version. I want the other side. I want to be in the nation built by God rather than the nation where we failed here. Yes, comment here. Bring in a mic.
Don't need a mic. I don't need a mic, but good morning, everybody. The way I looked at it is that you were talking about God's people here, Israel, and I'm thinking us. If we denigrate ourselves like that, I'm not worried about the world. I'm worried about trusting my brethren. That's my concern. And so we have to stay strong. We have to keep fortifying ourselves. We have to strengthen each other so that we don't end up like how Israel has ended up there.
Absolutely. Yeah, and this is a caution to the church, right? Like I can talk about America and our country, and I can make comments about that, but at the end of the day, America is not going to be the nation of God. It's going to be the people of Israel. It's going to be the church. And so this is a caution for us. Thank you. Other comments? Okay, we'll cover the last section here. And then with the time we have left, I've got some just wrap-up thoughts about the book in particular. Let's look at verses 14 through 20. So in verses 14 through 20, I think the prophet really, as many of the prophets in their writing do, he brings it down to a smaller moment. I think he begins to pray, and I think we get some intimate thoughts on his behalf. In verse 14, he prays that, and he recognizes that God is going to serve as a guiding hand for his people, a shepherd over the flock of his possessions, and he's going to bring this flock into a fruitful field. God's going to provide for his people, and he will protect for them, as he did in days of old. And so this is why I don't want to cast out the days of old completely, because it is important for us to recognize the things God's already done. Because if we look at his behavior in the past, I think we can have a steady understanding of what his behavior is going to be like in the future. So just as God has judged in the past, he judged Israel before, he's going to save them and he's going to protect them as well. We saw that in chapter 6. There were some moments, particularly where the Exodus was referenced, the way God protected them against Balaam and Barak in that story, and on how he cared for them in their wandering in the wilderness. So there's elements of that are being referenced here as well in verse 15. As in the days of old when you went out from the land of Egypt, I will show you miracles, or I will show you wondrous things, he says. There's a time, or there was a time, when God's people enjoyed this desperately close relationship with him. And now I think the prophet is praying that that relationship will be restored and that he will show them these wonders again. You remember the things that happened in Exodus. When we're close to God, we're going to be party to cosmos shaking things, right? All of Egypt was shaken up by the wonders that God performed in their midst. Things that he did to that nation, to Pharaoh, in order to prove to them that he was God, that he was in control, and that his word, his command, should be followed. Even though Pharaoh pushed against him over and over and over and over again, the very forces of nature were brought down on Egypt. And so I think we need to be marveling at that, right? God is the one who created the cosmos, and so of course he has control over it. And when he brings those powers to bear on our behalf, I think we should be recognizing that. Ephesians chapter 3, verses 20 through 21. Now to him who is able to do exceedingly, abundantly above all that we ask or think, according to the power that works in us, to him be the glory in the church by Christ Jesus to all generations, forever and ever. Amen. God, he did wonders for the people of Israel. He's going to do them again, and I think we can reasonably expect that God will do wondrous things for us as well. And so that's something we need to be looking to him for. We need to be in the moment when nothing else seems to work, when all desperation has enveloped us, we look to God for our salvation, even though it might be impossible. In verse 16, the nations are going to have their agency removed out of them out of sheer shame in the face of God's greatness. It says they will be dumb, they will be deaf, they will eat the dust. They will come seeking God's favor, but instead, Israel is going to be restored to the land and will enjoy this restored relationship with the Lord, especially when those who have opposed God's people will come to see just how wrong they were to fight against God. I think seeing the greatness of God's restoration will make the nations respect the Lord in a way that they didn't before, is something that I think is being alluded to here. Of course, that's going to be a result of the fact that they will see the power and love of God in action. Some other thoughts here in verse 18. The prophet knows that God's mercy is going to be more powerful than his judgment. Turn over. And he asks this question, who is a God like you, pardoning iniquity and passing over transgression for the remnant of his inheritance? It sounds very much like the questions that were being asked in chapter 6. When Israel's restored to the land, they're going to get this restored relationship. And God's forgiveness is going to be so great that the prophet's overwhelmed by it here. He asks why God has such great mercy and forgiveness for his people who've obviously committed great sins throughout the course of this book. And the reason I think we see is because it's just in God's nature. This is who he is. It's simply because he delights in mercy, and we get portraits of that here. So God, he's full of justice, right? We've seen that. But here the prophet is remarking on the way that he cares about mercy and cares about the people as well. Of course, at the end of the section here in verse 20, God's going to keep the covenantal promises that were made to Abraham. I think we can reference those back in Genesis chapter 12, 15, and such. All nations are going to find a blessing. In concluding this prophecy, Micah sees that God's future work is a continuation of his past work. This isn't something new. This is God continuing to do what he's already promised to do. He promised this work to the fathers of Israel, and Micah knows that the same love, the compassion, and the mercy that he showed to those men is what will be available to the people today. And so there's always hope, right? God is a God of salvation. The destruction, the judgment that the Lord brings upon his people is not the end here if it is received in faith. I think there's a lot of assurance here, a lot of promises that the prophet sort of meditates on, things that we can take to heart, we can hide within ourselves. We can see the mercy and the judgment of God, and we can balance those out, wrestle with that, work that out in your mind. And I think if we can pray the same prayers that Micah's praying here at the end, then we're going to be in the right place. It's incredible to me, the way that these men, these prophets were given just visions of horrible, horrible things. And yet, with that great tragedy, with the great evil that comes along with it, this is how they end their prophecies. they remark on the greatness of God, his mercy, and his justice. It's beautiful, and it's an example to me. I think this is the way I want to think about God. I want to think about a God who not only cares about the evils that are occurring on earth, but will, mercifully deal with his people, even when they have committed great sin. Let's see. Okay. Did I miss anything? Oh, yeah, this phrase, you will cast their sin into the depths of the sea. This is that should give you a sense of great distance, right? The sea is this big and it's this wide, right? I can't see the other end. If you've ever been to the ocean, it's incredible to me. Just water for nothing, like as far as you can see. That's how far away our sins are going to be taken away from us. I think we need to see that image and just realize the greatness of it. Okay, thoughts, comments, questions about the final section here. We'll discuss a few minutes, and then I've got just some takeaways from the rest of the book. Aaron.
I want to go to the end of verse 18, where it talks about he does not hold on to his anger forever because he delights in faithful love. It's in the character of God to enjoy the idea of faithfulness. It's in the character of God to delight in steadfastness and compassion. And that's why he doesn't hold on to his anger forever. I think there's a lot to be said for, if I want to be like God, it's not enough for me to just not hold on, don't let the sun go down on your wrath, right? We're familiar with those ideas of not being angry, but sometimes we're missing that why component. And it's because God enjoys forgiving people. God gets something out of being a compassionate and a faithful God. And that's in his character. So I have, I'm sure everybody has situations like this. Somewhere in my family, there's a father and son who have a strained relationship. And it's because they are holding on to something, both of them are holding on to this thing that happened years ago. And they just neither of them can seem to let it go. But they don't delight in their relationship together, because if they did, they'd get over that. And they'd find a way to forgive each other. And so somehow this thing that they're holding on to has become more important than their faithful love for each other. We need to make sure that that's not how we deal with things if we want to be like God.
Very good. Scott.
As we went through this chapter and really this book, and it doesn't surprise me, but it reminds me so much. I mean, so much of the prophet's message are the same between various different prophets. Of course, some are shorter, some are longer. But as we were going through the chapter, my thoughts were continually going back to the book of Ezekiel. And the reason is because, I was thinking in the chapter, verse 8, when he tells his enemies not to rejoice over him, the implication is the enemies are going to be rejoicing when God punishes his own people. In Ezekiel, he says the same thing. I allowed my name to be profaned. Let you profane my name, and that's why you're going into captivity, because you profane my name. But then you have the glory that he says that there's coming a day I am going to vindicate my holy name. And in Ezekiel 34, he says, I'm going to sprinkle clean water on you, and you're going to be clean. I mean, the implication about their sins being forgiven, it's all the glorious hope that still awaits. God has not cast off his people. They are going to be punished for their wicked behavior, but that punish is meant to bring them back to God. And we see the fulfillment in Ezekiel not being physical Israel after the captivity, because if you look at that period, they could not have fulfilled all that was in the book of Ezekiel, but we see it spiritually. And we talked about at the end of Ezekiel that was the Messiah's temple, and that's us. And so what we see ultimately in the fulfillment, God vindicates his name through his Son and the sending forth of his Spirit and bringing spiritual Israel into great prominence. And that's when he says, in Ezekiel, he says, then everyone will know that I am God. And I think that's just a great joy to see, the ultimate fulfillment of God's purposes, and it gives us great responsibility on ourselves.
Yeah, there's a lot of responsibility that comes along with knowing this message, right? Not only recognizing who God is and what he wants, because that's the question, right? What does God want? And I think we saw that answer in chapter 6. Good. So I know our time is short, what's been allotted to me. So here's some things I want you to take away from the book as a whole. Lessons from Micah. If you didn't get anything else in the class, I hope you got this. First of all, don't ignore warnings of wrongdoing. Judgment is sure to follow. The sins of greed and oppression are going to bring destruction upon our nation and our church. It'll bring destruction down upon us just like it did upon Israel. The hubris of the sins of the people wouldn't even allow them to admit that they've sinned, so don't do that. And don't be surprised when God's judgment comes. I pray we don't fall into the same trap. So take that to heart. God must confront evil. He must judge evil, especially among his people. And I think God's covenantal love and his promises are going to be more powerful than human evil, certainly within our midst and certainly within the midst of our nation. God delights in love, and so he will show compassion again. He will toss our sin into the depths of the sea, like this passage says. We need to have hope in God's salvation despite the righteous consequences of sin. God's going to shepherd the remnant of his people. We saw that in chapter 2, verses 12 and 13. God's going to build a nation at his mountain, and he will fill it with his presence. And the remnant of his people in chapter 4, verses 1 through 7, those people will be cared for. And a messianic king is going to come and rule over God's people. They're going to remove evil from the world and will bless all people in chapter 5. And I would ask you to join me in yearning for that place. I think Jesus is that king. I think Jesus is here. I think his kingdom's been established. And I think we're working towards the finalization of that image. And of course, the answer to our question about the entire class, what does God want? Do justice, love mercy, walk humbly with your God, chapter 6. That's it. That's what God wants. He wants you. He wants you to do these things. I love this book, and I hope that you will take the lessons we've learned here. I hope you will apply them to our next study in Malachi. There's a lot of overlap. There's a lot of those same ideas that carry forward. And I want this to stick with you because I think the stories and the prophets, even though they were written long ago to a people that is not our own, I think they carry these timeless ideas for us, these timeless truths for us. I think they help us understand who God is. I think they help us see what we can do, how we can live lives that are pleasing to him, as is most of the scripture. But this is the book of Micah as I see it. These are the lessons that I've got for you. Any final comments, any questions, anything else we want to say that has not been said, I guess? Okay. Thank you for your attention. Thank you.